So that comes from their emergentist and social psychological underpinnings, I think.
An emergentist, what do you mean by that?
Well, they're much more. This you always worry about overgeneralizing. They had two main emphases. One is on how do social movements emerge, and it's always been the case that still today that students of social movements focus more on mobilization than they do on stasis or demobilization. So, you know, there's not much fun in sawing how civil rights movements has left some traces, but it's no more, is not what it was, right? I knew somebody, prominent African-American sociologist, who talked about studying the civil rights movement in the doldrums, but he never did it, as far as I can tell. So, you know, that's partly, even though incidentally, it's not true of the Chicago people, but in general, an awful lot of people only study the movements that they like. So the ratio of studies of the civil rights movement to the study of the Ku Klux Klan is about 10 to 1. And there are a couple good studies of the Ku Klux Klan. It's not as if they're never been studied, or the the counter movement to attempt to keep blacks down, which is a significant part of American history. There are a couple of good people who've studied it, but if you were to just do a search for articles on the civil rights movement versus, or even if you broaden it beyond the Ku Klux Klan to the whole groups and organizations that the white citizens councils, local anti-desegregation groups, you know, you'd still not find a tenth of the studies of that versus the movement that people identified with. So that's just there. The only case I can think of that doesn't fit that model is a major part of political sociology in the 1950s was an attempt to understand the rise of the Nazi movement and how that happened, how it took over society. So there, you know, and there is this relationship between the study of social movements and the historical movements that are prominent at the time.
And fascist movements also.
Yes, right,
Italy
in more general, that's right. It broadened into, okay, fascist movements in general, right.
Yeah, that's...
did I answer your question there?
I think you did. I mean, you did, for sure, and I'm still intrigued at it. Would you say that the Chicago School continues to inspire, continues to offer kind of, I don't know, new perspectives, a good basis for, you know, for a next generation of sociology graduate students, for example?
Well, it is the case that there's some questions that they were good at handling that got bypassed. And there are a couple of people who have tried to draw attention to some of that. You know, one of the contributions of Resource MOB and the whole modern turn, which is basically a late 60s through late 70s genesis, and we've gotten an awful lot of mileage out of the intellectual developments out of that. There's tending to run down a little bit now, but nevertheless 30 years of pretty productive period. Well, you also broke from certain things. You didn't assume that in the old Chicago school, you assumed that you had milling about, you had collective activity, search for answers, and then slowly a social movement emerged from that. But it kind of denied history. And so one of the things that we did, and others, is break from that and say that, look, there are activists out there, there are moral entrepreneurs out there who are, throughout the 20s and 30s, thinking about the problem of race in American society as it was filtered to them at that time. And then they're sitting around looking for an opportunity. So Martin Luther King, for instance, is a student of Gandhi. And long before Rosa Parks sits down on the bus in Birmingham, Martin Luther King has been learning the lessons that he could use and going to meetings with other like-minded activists. And there's a new book out by a Yale history professor that has there's a good review in New York Times on activists, civil rights activists in the 1930s and 40s.
Mm-hmm.
You know, well before we think of the movement as really taking off. It's not as if it takes off fresh. And the point of this is that activists then look around and may or may not pick up on some collective incident, the milling that's going on in a particular community. But to the extent that there are these activists and these histories, Rosa Parks herself is an example of this, that people always, the journalists always treat her as this poor black woman who's a house cleaner. They forget that for 20 years she was secretary of the NAACP in Montgomery.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
We're coming to the end here,
Sure.
but there are a couple of other ideas of yours or pieces of writing of yours I've found very interesting. I think I'll mention one and ask you about the other. I am very intrigued and excited to see that you've made the case that the social sciences need to pay more attention to the humanities.
You bet.
And that's a pretty interesting idea. You've talked about literary theory, for example, as being in some way relevant, which I think addresses also the question about imagination, and then philosophy as well. You've talked about the value that philosophy can bring to the social sciences. The thing I guess maybe I'll close with is your very interesting analysis of the concept of progress and the concept of accumulation or cumulativeness of sociological knowledge. And again, I think that's a really interesting pair of ideas. You do such an interesting job of separating out what the
Trying
two...
to separate.
Yeah.
Right.
So maybe we could just close up and you could just talk about that a little bit.
Well, first I want to say that the connection to philosophy is what's much on my mind these days. I've taught that a course, I guess now it's about my third time, and this spring at Irvine I will be teaching a version of a seminar on sociology and philosophy again, and every time I get into it I learn so much, and a lot of it's beyond me because it's like reading another language if you do the philosophy seriously. And I taught 2-3 years ago with Elizabeth Anderson of the philosophy department. She and I did a seminar together, and there weren't many students in it, but when the philosophers got into a long discussion of technical philosophy, I really often didn't know what they were talking about. You know, it's kind of a language, up-to-date where the art is and what these terms mean in context of ongoing historical debates, or evolving debates within philosophy. And so the problem of learning that language is very hard, but I still get very enthusiastic about it. It's still a great learning experiment. Right, so I think that's very important, and this particular thing on progress and accumulation, it really, that's where this use of the term architecture, because you see the extent to which you're so constrained, every community of the humanities and the social sciences is so constrained by the meta-assumptions they make about what is usable evidence, and whenever somebody tries to change those, they may create a little mini-movement, and maybe at some point they in fact take over a whole sub-discipline, but so often you see the wider discipline coming back to